All right. Today we are going to be in the book of Joshua, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 24. So it's the entire chapter and it's a little bit long. So I'll ask you just to sit back and listen to the word of the Lord and to let it seep into your soul. But before we do that, I want to kind of bring you up to speed and let you know where our text begins. What has happened up to this point? So Moses has died in Moab. So he did not get to enter into the promised land. He died in Moab. So if I point my hand up here, this was Egypt, okay? And the Israelites, when they left Pharaoh, they came around here to the bottom, and this area right here is the wilderness. And the Israelites, because they were stubborn and they would not respond to God in the proper way, they spent 40 years in this area down here. And when our text picks up, they are actually beginning to enter into the promised land, which is also known as the land of Canaan. And it's just right up here around this corner, right here. So they really didn't have far of a journey to go, but they were just very selfish individuals. So 40 years, a whole generation practically had to be wiped out before they were ready. Their hearts were in the right spot before they were ready to move on into the promised land. They had two immediate obstacles in their way. One was Jericho. We talked about that several weeks ago, that massive walled city of Jericho, and the Jordan River. So the river was the first in their path. They arrived to the river during the harvest period, and during this time the banks just overflowed. It was kind of like the flood season, and the river had overflown its banks, so there was lots of water, and they camped along there for several days. And finally 12 men were chosen from the tribes to carry the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people, in front of the people. And once those 12 priests stepped into the water of the Jordan River, the water stopped flowing and stood up as a tall mass. Now, this is the second time that the Lord has delivered the Israelites from water. So when they left Egypt, it was the Red Sea, right, that was parted. So water was up here, and the whole nation of Israel crossed over on dry land. And at that time, it was thousands, tens of thousands. Some even say it could have been high as 1 million with children and women. We don't know that for sure, but we know that it was tens of thousands of people crossing the Red Sea on dry ground. Well, here God has done it for them again. And this is the Jordan River that they are crossing. And when the priests with the Ark of the Covenant they're carrying, they step into the water goes up, and they're able to pass over on dry land. Now, there's no mud, there's no clay, it's just dry dirt. And as long as those priests were standing in the river bank, or the river waterway there, the water was held back. So now I'm going to read to you chapter 4 of Joshua. Hear the word of the Lord. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at a place where you will stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask, "What do these stones mean?" tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are still there to this day. Now the priests who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people, just as Moses had directed Joshua. The people hurried over, and as soon as all of them had crossed, the ark of the Lord and the priests came to the other side while the people watched. The men of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh crossed over, ready for battle in the front of the Israelites, as Moses had directed them. About 40,000 armed for battle crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for war. That day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all of Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they had stood in awe of Moses. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant law to come up out of the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up out of the Jordan." And the priests came out of the river carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." Thanks be to God for the reading and the hearing of his word. As you know, a memorial helps us to remember important things. Many communities have Memorial Day parades and celebrations to remember those who died in the line of duty. Of course, this year's celebrations may look and feel different because of social distancing. There are many famous memorials you will recognize, and you may have even visited them, such as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Have you ever had the opportunity to visit that? It's wonderful. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit it, you still might have images in your mind of pictures that you have seen. Maybe the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial in New York, just to name a few. All of these memorials help us to remember a specific event in history, a point in time that we should never forget. Often they help us to remember jubilant victories, and other times these monuments help us to remember devastating losses that we've experienced. But they all should generate in us a thankfulness for our freedoms, gratefulness to those that paid with their lives, and overall a sense of celebration of bravery and courage. Often in the Old Testament scriptures, we see stones being used to mark a place when God did something extraordinary. And I brought this stone to show you today. And I imagine the stones that they got out of the river were larger than this. But stones were used in the Old Testament as reminders when God had done something wonderful. For instance, in Exodus 12:14, Moses built an altar of stones to commemorate God's covenant with Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai. And in 1 Samuel chapter 7, at Mizpah, the Israelites won against the Philistines after losing a number of battles to them prior. Excuse me. Samuel took a stone and he set it down and he called it Ebenezer. The Lord helped us. So Ebenezer is translated, it means the stone of help. So these memorial stones in our scripture today have three purposes. Well, they may have more than three purposes, but today we're just going to talk about three of them. And the first is to remember what God has done. The stones were to be a personal reminder to those that were present on the journey. So they were the people who actually saw this firsthand, an eyewitness account, if you will. These stones were to remind those individuals what they felt, what they saw, what they heard. And they were encouraged to tell this story to others. By telling the story again and again, you retain a clearer memory of what God has done for you. And I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more difficult time I have remembering things. You know, you walk into a room, what did I come in here for? I particularly have a difficult time with names. People that I know, their name just escapes me. So I don't know what's going to happen in the next 20 years, but it's not fun when you can't remember things. But as you relive the experience when you're telling the story about what God did for you, this is going to keep God, the wonder and the awe of God, fresh in your life. What kind of memorials do you have in your life today? Now, whether you realize it or not, we do have memorials in our lives. Now, you're probably not going to have monuments of stones in your front yard or maybe on your porch or in your kitchen or your living room. But you will have built memories over the years of special places and people who have been used to connect you more closely with God. What places bring back special memories in a spiritual sense? Maybe it's walking into the church that you were married in, or maybe the church that you were baptized in. You can remember all the nerves that you had or the excitement that you had during these times. I have a sweet memory of a Nazarene church basement where we would sing songs about the Lord when I was very small. I loved to sing, and I was always sit in the front row as close to the piano as I could get. Then later as a teenager, in a United Methodist Church Sunday school room, I have memories about asking questions about the Lord and why I should get to know Him. I had the opportunity several years ago to speak in that very same church. Just like those stones in Gilgal, that place brought back powerful memories. And we also have memories of the people who God used in our life. That piano player that I tried to get as close to as I could taught me the words to those songs about God. Remember, deep and wide, one of my favorites. And I remember her. I remember her kindness to me in teaching me those words. And then also that Sunday school teacher where I ask all those questions, he never lost his patience with me. And trust me, I had endless questions. And he never, ever lost his patience. And when I spoke at that church, I had the opportunity to personally thank him for what he had done for me all of those years ago. And that's the thing about planting seeds. We don't always get to see the harvest. But he was such a powerful person in my young life that I wanted to make sure he knew the difference that he had made in my world. The second thing is that the stones were to be used to share their faith with their children. When the children asked, "What do these stones mean?" they were to share that the Lord separated the waters and everybody crossed on dry ground. Teaching the children what the Lord has done gives them hope for tomorrow, because we don't know what kind of world tomorrow is really going to be. But they need to have His hope in their life. I wish that I would have written down things when my son was young. I have a very, very sweet memory of him. He had just turned five, so it must have been late in the middle of March. And him and I were in the living room. He was playing with his toys, and on TV was Colby's Clubhouse. And it was a little Christian show, and they had puppets, and they were always talking about Jesus and how Jesus lives in our heart. And I remember Zach stopping what he was doing and looking up at me and saying, "Mommy, I want Jesus in my heart." Oh, it was just so precious. So I grabbed his little hands and we prayed that Jesus would enter his heart. And I wish that I had written that down, because I don't remember some of the details that would have been awesome. And then later on, he must have been a little bit older. I'm going to say around 7. His Uncle John had gotten a hound dog. What are they called? Yeah, a hound dog. And they named him Copper, because at that time, Zach was watching the Disney movie, The Hound and the something. The Fox and the Hound, thank you. Yes, The Fox and the Hound. And that dog was named Copper. So they named this new hound beagle Copper. Copper Joe was his name. And Zach became very good friends with this little dog. And Uncle John taught him to be a rabbit dog. And they went hunting one day, and Copper never came back. So I'm not a hunter, but I understand that hunters lay their coats down and the dog will come back after a period of time because of the scent. So Uncle John would go back every day for a few days, no Copper, no Copper. And finally a week went by, and they had almost given up hope that this dog was ever going to come back. And before school one day, Zach was telling me this, "Copper's not back." I said, "Well, would you like to pray and see if Jesus will bring him back?" And I'm thinking in my head as an adult, Mom, okay, do I say that Jesus will bring the dog back? And what if Jesus doesn't bring the dog back? And so we prayed that God would bring the dog back, that it would be His will to return Copper to us. And wouldn't you know, the next day, Copper returned. We were so blessed. And this built the faith of my young son. And those are so important. And wouldn't it have been awesome when he got married that I could have given him a little booklet of all the wonderful things that God had did in his life and in our life when we were young, as he began his new life with his wife in a family. So I kind of messed up there, but God is so good that we need to remember to tell our stories to our children and to anyone who will listen how awesome that He is. And then thirdly, the stones would remind all who were taking that journey that it wasn't completed in their own strength, but in the power of the Lord, by the goodness of the Lord, by the provision of the Lord. Without the Lord, none of us here today would be where we are. We can look at the stones and be reminded that the past is in the past. The failures are in the past. Those rebellious Israelites, those 40 years wandering around in the wilderness because they were selfish. It's in the past. We're moving on. God is going to deliver them to the promised land. They're going to receive now the promise that He had given them. God is providing a way. The complaining and the hopelessness that they did in the desert for those 40 years are in the past. Can we say that in our own lives today? That the failure and the complaining is in the past, and we are ready to receive the goodness that God has for us. We should be looking back in our lives and identifying those times that God changed our direction because He had something better for us. He wanted to give us a new sense of hope and a new sense of purpose. My hope is that you never look at a rock the same. That instead of just a rock, you see the monumental occasions in your life that God has showed up in big ways to encourage you, to provide for you, and to comfort you. That you remember these times. You talk about these times with your children and those who will listen. Most importantly, I pray that as you remember God's goodness in your life, you look forward in expectant hope of what He will do in your future. According to Ephesians 3:20, He is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can ask or even imagine. Trust the Lord this day and be reminded of His goodness, His power, and His provision. Amen.